By the autumn of 2015, the war in Afghanistan had entered a quieter, uncertain phase. The NATO-led mission that had once commanded hundreds of thousands of troops was all but over. Most foreign forces had withdrawn. What remained was a fragile Afghan government, propped up by international aid, holding fast against a stubborn insurgency that refused to die. The Taliban had been pushed into the margins, into rural valleys, mountain passes, and the hinterlands of a country weary from decades of conflict. In major cities like Kabul, Kandahar, and Herat, life went on. The government held its ground, and many dared to believe that the worst was over. But in the north, far from the corridors of power and international attention, the city of Kunduz stood as a lonely outpost on the edge of stability. A gateway to Central Asia, its location was strategic, and its fate precarious. Whispers of Taliban activity had grown louder in recent months. There were rumors of fighters moving through the countryside, of sleeper cells waiting for a signal. Then, just before dawn on a late September morning, the silence broke in Kunduz. A sudden assault, coordinated and ruthless, would push the Afghan forces to their limits. Was this attack on Kunduz a show of force and the Taliban's return to power? Or was it a final desperate attempt to seize control? A last stand for the Taliban? Welcome to Wars of the World. By the early 2010s, the Taliban had begun to show unsettling signs of resurgence across Afghanistan after being removed from power in 2001. The insurgency had long been centered on Kandahar, its spiritual birthplace, and the Afghan capital of Kabul, where suicide bombers and elite target attacks firmly kept international and local attention. For instance, the June 2015 attack on the Kabul parliament demonstrated the Taliban's continued ability to strike at the heart of power in a highly symbolic way. Security discussions remained overwhelmingly focused on protecting Kabul and southern strongholds, while the nation's north was increasingly taken for granted, and deployments from the International Security Assistance Force, the ISAF, in the north remained thin. This revealed cracks in Afghan security. Insurgents had space to organize, checkpoints multiplied, and local warlords filled the void. NATO's combat mission formally ended in December 2014, disbanding the ISAF after 13 years. In its place came the smaller Resolute Support Advisory Mission, limited to training, advising, assisting, and protecting advisors, but prohibited from any frontline combat. Roughly 13,000 coalition troops remained, including about 10,000 Americans, yet they lacked autonomy to intervene unless directly threatened. This shift created a dangerous limbo in territorial control. The Taliban began a strategic recalibration in 2010, when their forces were deliberately redirected into the northern provinces. Insurgents moved from their southern bastions into regions like Kunduz, Baghlan, and Badakhshan, in an effort to demonstrate reach and influence. By the time international combat forces withdrew, the north had transitioned from a mostly peaceful region to one rife with insurgent checkpoints, recruitment, and clandestine operations. Beginning in April 2015, the Taliban launched probing offensives around Kunduz. One report noted that by May, parts of the Shah Dara district were intensely contested, forcing the government to rely on local militias, the Arbaki, and later the Afghan local police to hold ground. Although Afghan national security forces pushed back against the Taliban, their presence was never sustained. Just months later, Taliban fighters re-entered districts that had previously been cleared. By summer 2015, control of Kunduz province had become a patchwork, with civilian and militia loyalties shifting as Taliban checkpoints pressed ever closer. During this time, there had been warning signs that were ignored. Analyst Michael Kugelman observed, quote, "The Taliban had been eyeing the city for months, so the city's capture by the insurgents suggests an inability or an unwillingness on the part of the Afghan forces to confront this threat ahead of time." End quote. Fragmented Afghan military and political leadership, including the absence of a confirmed defense minister, meant key decisions were delayed or never made at all. Taliban commanders capitalized on these gaps, quietly embedding sleeper cells within Kunduz city. By staging attacks from Chardara, Aliabad, Kanabad, and Imam Sahib districts, they effectively ring-fenced the city, waiting for the later siege. Thus, by the autumn of 2015, the convergence of weakened NATO presence, fragile Afghan command, and resurgent Taliban activity had formed the perfect storm. The north, once an afterthought, had become a pressure point, with Kunduz at its epicenter. While the world fixated on Kabul and Kandahar, northern insurgents were preparing their staging ground, and Kunduz, long regarded as secure, was about to pay the price. On the early morning of September 28, 2015, as pre-dawn darkness lay heavy over Kunduz, Taliban insurgents launched a meticulously coordinated assault. Their attack emanated from at least 3 directions: Chardara to the west, Aliabad to the south, Kanabad to the east, and Imam Sahib to the north, signalling a rare strategic convergence in the Afghan conflict. Within hours, the city's northern and southern approaches were under harassment from enemy checkpoints, as government movement and supply lines were disrupted. Taliban fighters used a blend of sleeper cells and overt mule tactics. Under the cover of advancing columns, they swept into town, freeing hundreds of inmates from the provincial jail, and attacking the police stations and military compounds in rapid succession. This blitzkrieg-style operation took many Afghan security personnel by surprise. Despite having around 7,000 Afghan soldiers and policemen in the city, far outnumbering the estimated 5,000 to 1,000 Taliban assailants, many units collapsed swiftly, abandoning their posts as urban combat erupted. With government forces in disarray, the remaining defenders scrambled to regroup around Kunduz airport, a small island of resistance that lay on the city's western outskirts. Hundreds of police, military personnel, and civilians fled there for shelter. Multiple reports soon flowed in of families being turned away at the airport's gates, however, many being forced to remain trapped within Taliban-controlled neighborhoods. By the afternoon, Taliban fighters had staged a powerful symbol of their defiance by raising their white flag over Chowk Square, signaling their first hold over an Afghan provincial capital since 2001. They paraded through the city in commandeered police SUVs, took selfies around the governor's office, and publicly mounted their banner atop government structures: a bank, a hospital, a police HQ. It was a chilling statement of Taliban dominance. The civilians, meanwhile, were left in a limbo of fear and uncertainty. Streets were largely deserted, homes locked and silent. An Al Jazeera report explained, quote, "Kunduz city was on lockdown. The city's streets were deserted as residents barricaded themselves indoors. Heavy fighting raged across the city as roads were blocked and some police stations were surrounded by Taliban fighters." End quote. One town resident, speaking over the phone to The Guardian with gunfire in the background, said, quote, "At the moment, it seems like the army is not even fighting. Civilians can't leave their houses. The Taliban won't allow them." End quote. Hospitals overflowed with wounded caught in the streets and crossfire. One Doctors Without Borders center reported receiving 66 serious injuries on the opening day alone, including 8 dead on arrival. Inside the airport compound, tension and desperation built. Afghan forces, backed by limited US special operations and air support, prepared to counterattack. But the airport was under blockade. Roads entering or leaving were mined. Taliban snipers loomed on ridges, and morale among besieged troops plummeted. Reinforcements from other provinces desperately tried to breach the ring, but they were slowed by insurgent ambushes and roadside bombs. By nightfall, Taliban control of Kunduz appeared consolidated. They picked through government offices, freed allies, secured captured weapons, and looted banks for financial gain. Tribal and complicit civilian support fluctuated. Some residents submitted from fear, while others reported that Taliban fighters were not threatening them for now, urging local shops to remain open and normal life to resume. This attack was not merely an insurgent raid, it was a de facto takeover. Kunduz had fallen with little resistance, revealing not just a military failure, but systematic collapse, with broken leadership, fractured communication, and underestimations on every level. When journalists finally entered the city, they recorded scenes of Taliban fighters roaming freely, hospitals overwhelmed, and civilians too fearful to step outside. The city had changed over to Taliban hands, not contested or besieged, but simply taken. With the Taliban now firmly in control of Kunduz, the remaining Afghan government forces were driven back to a precarious defensive position at Kunduz airport. Reinforcements were urgently deployed, roughly 5,000 Afghan troops, with local militias and special units converging on the perimeter, hoping to mount a counterattack. But the Taliban had anticipated this move. The main access roads were laced with improvised explosive devices, known as IEDs, and lined them with insurgent checkpoints, which slowed government convoys to a crawl. Late on the 29th of September, Afghan forces, who were already exhausted, were struggling to organize themselves. President Ashraf Ghani called for calm and declared his government was mobilizing to retake the city. But local commanders admitted they were only defending, lacking the will or resources to attack. One district chief, Mohammed Zahir Niazi, grimly noted, quote, "We still have enough forces to take on the Taliban, but sadly there is no will or resolve to fight." End quote. It was in this dire moment that US and NATO forces intervened more assertively. On the night of September 30th, US Special Forces advisor teams at the airport came under direct attack. Colonel Brian Trebus, a resolute support spokesman, confirmed they engaged in self-defense, and that up to 100 US special operators assisted the Afghan soldiers, marking one of the first ground fire engagements since 2014. 3 airstrikes were launched that evening, targeting captured Taliban tanks and a meeting of insurgent commanders, effectively halting an imminent breach. Meanwhile, urban warfare raged across Kunduz. Afghan special forces, backed by NATO advisors and air cover, launched sporadic raids on the city. Caught in the crossfire were the terrified civilians. One male resident told CNN about his experience, quote, "We don't know what to do and where to go. I was near the main roundabout of Kunduz when the fight between government forces and the Taliban became intense, and the Taliban fighters were firing back meters away from me. I was running to get to a safe place when shrapnel hit my hand. I was wounded." End quote. He then explained that shops had closed, there was a city-wide blackout, and that it was becoming difficult to find food. He then noted, "Kunduz has turned into a ghost city." On the outskirts of the city, of particular note was the Battle of Kandahari. A joint US-Afghan patrol, acting on intelligence of a Taliban staging point, was surrounded. When insurgents fired from multiple directions, the coalition troops called in airstrikes from C-130 and Apache helicopters to break free, sustaining losses but forcing the insurgents back. These pockets of combat punctuated the wider struggle for city control, highlighting both Taliban adaptability and the Afghan security forces' reliance on air power. Taliban fighters were not passive either. They launched counter-offensives of their own. As Afghan troops pressed forward, militants counterattacked with ambushes and roadside bombs. One Taliban commander admitted that their tactics aimed to spread the Afghan forces thin, attacking from multiple fronts to disrupt cohesive defense. In the chaos, command and control often broke down. Units were cut off, supply trucks turned back, and communications failed. By October 1st, Afghan forces had recaptured key government buildings and parts of the city centre, aided by US air support and special advisors on the ground. Sadiq Siddiqui, speaking for the Afghan Interior Ministry, claimed the Taliban had suffered heavy casualties and were being pushed back towards the outskirts. Yet the battle remained fluid. Rather than a sweeping advance, it transformed into block-by-block clearing operations. Military sources reported isolated firefights which lasted deep into the night, with special forces and military advisors leading Afghan units in house-to-house searches. The airport remained the strategic anchor. Without it, retaking the city would prove impossible. For Afghan civilians, the fighting brought panic and deprivation. Al Jazeera cited that at least 110 to 200 civilians had been killed or wounded, with hospitals being overwhelmed and thousands fleeing. One resident radio station manager, Sadiqa Sheza, said, quote, "We are scared of leaving our homes, scared of being beaten by the Taliban. There's no electricity, no water, and ration shops are all closed." End quote. By the end of October 1st, Afghan forces, though bruised and battered, had regained control of much of Kunduz city. But this hard-won progress came at a cost. Fragmented urban combat, eroded morale, a reliance on foreign advisors, and a civilian population being deeply affected. Fighting would continue sporadically until mid-October. But it was what happened in these early days, the desperate counterattack from the airport, the introduction of US special forces, and the street-to-street violence that would define the siege. It laid bare both Afghan military frailties and the extent to which their survival depended on international support. However, it would soon be actions on behalf of the American military that would put a spotlight on Kunduz, creating international scrutiny and outrage. In the early hours of October 3rd, 2015, as Afghan forces, backed by US advisors, continued to push into Kunduz city, intelligence indicated that Taliban fighters were entrenched within a compound on the city's western edge, rumoured to be used as a command centre or an arms depot. US military planners authorised a strike from an AC-130U Spectre gunship, a highly accurate, low-altitude aircraft designed for close air support in urban combat. The aim was to eliminate insurgent positions and to safeguard advancing Afghan troops near the building for the National Directorate of Security. The crew of the American gunship reportedly received coordinates and a description of the target by Afghan special forces. This intelligence proved fatally flawed, however. The aircraft arrived over east-central Kunduz shortly before 6 AM local time. Navigational equipment had malfunctioned, communication systems were down, and the crew believed they'd been hit by a rocket, forcing them off their intended path. In this confusion, they mistook the Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF Trauma Center, a Doctors Without Borders hospital, located roughly 300 meters from the intended target, for the enemy compound, described in the mission brief. Between 06-08 and 07-15, the gunship unleashed a barrage of 105mm cannon rounds on the hospital, pummeling the facility for over an hour, firing a total of 211 shells. The blast demolished the intensive care unit, the operating theatres, and wards where 105 patients and 80 staff had taken sanctuary. Staff and patients were trapped in a nightmare. The MSF details the heart-wrenching scene, quote, "Our patients burned in their beds. Our medical staff were decapitated or lost limbs. Others were shot from the air while they fled the burning building." End quote. Heyman Nagarathnam, the head of programs for MSF in northern Afghanistan, describes his experience as survivors raced towards bunkers while being pursued by the bombardment. Quote, "The bombs hit, and then we heard the plane circle round. There was a pause, then more bombs hit. This happened again and again. When I made it out of the office, the main hospital building was engulfed in flames. Those people that could had moved quickly to the building's 2 bunkers to seek safety, but patients who were unable to escape burned to death as they lay in their beds." End quote. By the time the airstrike had ended at 07:15, at least 42 people were dead, including 24 patients, 14 staff, and 4 other civilians, with dozens more being wounded. Prior to the attack, the hospital had meticulously shared its GPS coordinates repeatedly with United States, Afghan, and NATO authorities. MSF emphasized that no armed combatants were present inside, only wounded civilians, with no Taliban fighters using the facility as cover. But despite these precautions, the bombardment still went ahead. There were even multiple urgent distress calls made from MSF staff directly to the Resolute Support headquarters, but still, the bombing did not stop. The attack carried on for 17 minutes after the first warning had reached the military HQ, yet by then, the AC-130 had finished its strike. MSF denounced the attack as a war crime, demanding an independent inquiry. An official US military investigation took place in November, led by General John Campbell. He described the event as a tragic mistake, going on to attribute the disaster to, quote, "human error compounded by systems and procedural failures," end quote. He also cites misidentified target coordinates, malfunctioning communications, and the absence of no strike data aboard the aircraft. The investigation also revealed that while Afghan forces initially requested support against Taliban fighters near the hospital area, it was ultimately a US decision to bomb the area, carried out without full situational awareness. The international reaction was furious, and the fallout was immediate. MSF evacuated all staff and closed its only trauma hospital in northeastern Afghanistan. MSF General Director Christopher Stokes declared, quote, "It appears that 30 people were killed, and hundreds of thousands of people are being denied life-saving care in Kunduz, simply because the MSF hospital was the closest large building to an open field and roughly matched a description of an intended target." End quote. US authorities grounded the flight crew and detained members of the Special Operations Team pending further action. Despite President Obama's apology and the release of internal reports, MSF maintained that the military's inquiry fell short and demanded an independent investigation by the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. The bombing of Kunduz Hospital did more than destroy a building. It shattered trust in the coalition's stated adherence to international humanitarian law. It crippled medical support for the wounded and cast a long shadow over future humanitarian operations in conflict zones across Afghanistan and beyond. By mid-October 2015, after a brutal 2 weeks of combat, Afghan security forces, bolstered by US air power and tactical advisors, had largely retaken Kunduz. Government troops maintained control over most city precincts, and the insurgent-held areas dissolved as Taliban fighters slipped away, retreating to rural strongholds. The official narrative celebrated a victory, but by then, damage had been done. Among the legacies were staggering human and material costs. According to UN assessments, at least 848 civilians were killed or injured during the siege. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Shops, schools, and homes were reduced to rubble. The UN also reported that over 100,000 people were displaced, some fleeing into neighboring provinces, others huddled in IDP camps under harrowing conditions. Damage to local infrastructure also amplified the impact to this once bustling northern hub. At the same time, the Taliban swiftly claimed the attack on Kunduz as a victory. Zabihullah Mujahid, a spokesman for the Taliban, boasted, saying the attack had achieved our objectives, then going on to say that the Taliban were able to free hundreds of fighters from Kunduz prison, and that the Taliban had withdrawn in order to protect civilians from further American air raids. Images of white flags flying over captured institutions circulated widely online. Captured weaponry, looted bank vaults, and parade ground publicity fueled insurgent propaganda, and for many observers, Kunduz emerged as a psychological turning point, a potent symbol of Taliban resilience. Analysts were divided. Some saw Kunduz as a fleeting, localized success, a terrorist raid quickly rebuffed by Afghan forces with international backing. Others sounded alarms. Brookings described the Taliban's temporary governance as a highly impactful breaching of a province, warning that it could send shockwaves across northern Afghanistan. In retrospect, the siege of Kunduz did not mark the Taliban's last stand. Instead, it was a harbinger. The insurgents would continue mounting assaults on provincial capitals, Herat, Lashkar Gah, and even Kabul. And by August 2021, they would recapture Kunduz again, just days before overwhelming the Afghan government and seizing Kabul itself. The temporary loss of Kunduz in 2015 simply foreshadowed a broader collapse. So who exactly was Kunduz a last stand for? Certainly not the Taliban. They would return stronger. Perhaps you could argue that this was closer to a last stand for the Afghan government, and a grim preview of what lay ahead. Though the Taliban withdrew under pressure, the group used the brief occupation to showcase its enduring strength and organizational reach. The events of Kunduz in 2015 were not the closing chapters for the insurgents, but an early draft of the ending yet to come. The brief 2015 occupation would, in reality, be a precursor for the Taliban victory over Kunduz in 2021, followed by the collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban takeover in Kabul. So, where does this leave Afghanistan today? Currently, the Taliban remain firmly in control, ruling under the banner of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They operate through a caretaker government, installing loyalists in key ministries, but the regime lacks diplomatic legitimacy. As of now, only Russia has officially recognized them, while Western and many regional states continue withholding formal recognition due to ongoing human rights violations. The country endures a deep humanitarian emergency. More than 23 million Afghans, over half of the population, require aid for food, water, health, and sanitation. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International report severe crackdowns on women, journalists, and critics, with bans on secondary and university education for girls, public banishment of women from parks and workplaces, and the revival of brutal punishments, including public floggings and stoning. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court has issued warrants for the arrest of Taliban Supreme Leader Hibatullah Akhundzada and Chief Justice Haqqani for crimes against humanity related to the persecution of women and girls. Humanitarian NGOs and bilateral donors remain engaged. The United States has injected over $20 billion since 2021 in aid, but delivery is precarious, constrained by Taliban interference, sanctions, and limited formal recognition. Nations like Iran and Pakistan continue mass deportations back into Afghanistan, deepening the crisis for returning refugees, especially women. Security within Afghanistan has become a complex mosaic. While the Taliban face insurgent challenges, such as IS Khorasan, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, and the National Resistance Front, they have largely consolidated control over state structures. The economy has shrunk by 30 to 35% since the takeover and remains reliant on aid, but large-scale civil war has subsided. The fall and recapture of Kunduz in 2015 was a warning disguised as a turning point. It revealed the fragility of the Afghan state, the limits of international strategy, and the Taliban's evolving approach to warfare. Yet even then, few could have predicted that just 6 years later, the same group would retake not just Kunduz, but the capital Kabul, and reclaim the reins of power over the entire country. Today, the Taliban rules once again, but theirs is a government burdened by isolation, crippled by sanctions, and defined by repression. While the 2015 siege of Kunduz ultimately ended in a victory for the Afghan people, as of today, their future remains uncertain.